You're listening to the Thousand Hills Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Thousand Hills Podcast, where we seek to help mindful theology become powerful faith. Really reading out of Judges chapter 4, but we're going to cover the first chunk, the first big quarter of this stuff. This is not a verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter reading of Judges. This is going to be kind of encapsulating the biblical history there, and then going over the three main leaders of the Judges, who are Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, as well as giving us a lay of the land of what's going on in the book. So the book has a general narrative, and then we have little timepieces that are going in. There's little generations of different things, and we'll notice a theme about it as it kind of leads into the progression of the history of Israel. So, all right, guys, so today we're starting our study through the book of Judges. We will touch on every person mentioned as a judge or deliverer of Israel from chapter 1 to chapter 21, of which there are 12. This week we'll talk about the first 4, but before we do, it's important for us to establish what in the world this book is about, okay? The book of Judges follows the nation of Israel after a pivotal transition. So for a lot of us, we understand that Israel was a nation, right? But it didn't start that way. Israel started off as a family. We have the tribes named after a group of brothers, right? So when we meet the sons of Abraham, when we meet the sons of Isaac, when we see all this history coming together, we have one brother who sticks out from all the rest, right? Does anybody know his name? He's got a very fancy coat. Joseph, right? What's Joseph's main flaw, if you can call it that? He keeps telling his brothers what? It's going to be special and important. They're going to bow down to him, right? That doesn't go over well. So they throw him in a well. They sell him into slavery. What happens to him from there? Gets shipped out to Egypt, right? He serves under Potiphar. He gets promoted. He gets lied about by Potiphar's wife. He ends up in jail as a criminal. From there, he gets to interpret a dream for the Pharaoh. And what was that dream about? It was about an oncoming famine, exactly. God revealed, hey, Egypt's going to have a really hard time in the surrounding area. Food's going to dry up. So he says, we need to make a plan to store up food because we're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of nothingness, right? So not only do they store up enough for themselves, but they store up enough for people to come and inquire about buying food from them. During an economic disaster like a famine, this would have dramatically increased the importance of Egypt, right? The Egypt that we see later on has its foundations being built on moves like this. God blesses them because he blesses Joseph, right? Which leads to a very odd encounter. The brothers that sold Joseph into slavery have to appear before him to ask for food during a famine, right? And then what happens? Joseph ends up giving them the runaround a little bit, keeps Benjamin, right? Some other things like that. Ends up telling them, hey, I'm your brother. There's a reconciliation there. The family comes to Egypt. They get to stay there. They get to be fed. God delivers them through this, right? The next time we pick up on Israel, they're no longer a family. It's no longer a small tribe, right? It's not just a group of people. It's now a nation that has been taken under Egypt's control. They are now being served as slaves, right? They are now forced laborers. Who rises up to lead them out of Egypt? Moses, exactly. Moses rises up through the command of God to lead the people out, leads them into the desert, leads them around. They get to the promised land. They send in spies. How many of them come back with a good report? 2, Joshua and Caleb, right? The other 10, you're like, I got that story unlocked. The other 10 come back when there's giants in the land. There's no way we can do this. We need to break out. We need to cut away, right? And they are faithless as far as them thinking that God can deliver the land, the promised land, into their hands. For that, God says, your punishment's going to be you march around the desert until every last one of you from this generation are dead. All right? We have the exception of Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb lead the next generation into the promised land, where we see them overthrow areas like Jericho, right? And that story about them marching around the walls and the walls come down. Rahab's a part of that, right? They go conquering nation by nation, group by group, outpost by outpost, until they're taking the promised land. This, however, was going to be a process. It did not happen overnight. So over the course of Joshua's life, we see them take huge swaths of lands in which God told them to settle. However, upon Joshua's death, there was still work to be done. This is where the judges come in. This is where we're setting the table. We had a major transition from Moses to Joshua, and from Joshua, these are the leaders that come up after. But the dynamic of Israel changes. Because after Joshua, There was more obedience needed from Israel, and this is where the trouble starts. Rather than totally pushing the Canaanites out of the promised land, as they were instructed to, Israel started cutting deals or putting them into forced labor. Neither is what God told them to do. Why did they do this? Judges tells us that after Joshua's generation died out, another generation rose from Israel, but it says about them, they neither knew who God was, nor what he had done for Israel. Guys, that is a powerful condemnation. And it's not just on that crop of Israelites, but on the ones who had seen and didn't pass it down. This means that there's a generational breakdown because they have no knowledge of their God, even as they live in the fulfillment of his promises. Guys, as a parent, this is me preaching to myself, this is the importance of why we raise our kids and teach them well. Okay? Israel's now going to repeat mistakes that they had made previously and endure pain generation after generation because of a lack of a trickle-down effect. If you have seen God move in your life, God has tasked you with passing that knowledge down to your children. Otherwise, this may be something close to what the outcome looks like, right? Because their ignorance of the younger generation, this speaks of another generation's apathy. So for us, if God has blessed us, we find seasons in our life where there's rest, it's not a time to get complacent, all right? Because you know what? All the ways that you may have learned about God or I may have learned about God through our hardships doesn't just get passed down through the DNA. It's not hereditary, right? It's something that if they're not going to live out because they have this cushy life, if I was raised in a Christian home by Christian parents who love me, who did the right things for me, they're not going to have personal hardships the same way we had to. They're going to have better and better homes, right? Meaning at some point they're going to take for granted what they're living in. They're not going to give God glory. They're going to see no reason to submit to him, which is going to break that good chain in the family and start another bad one. For my family, we had generation after generation of divorce, alcoholism, and domestic abuse. My parents are like the first marriage, their generation, that worked in like 3 generations. All my uncles, all my aunts, my grandparents, married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced. Like at least 1 marriage. Some of them up to like 7, and then they died divorced. All right? Craziness. My parents' generation, my dad and his brothers, my mom, they're the first ones to stay married together. So me, I don't know what that hardship's like. I don't know what it's like to have an alcoholic parent beating you around the house. They grew up with that stuff. They grew up with abandonment and things like that. So if I don't take the time to pour into my kids how good they have it, how much God has blessed them, they have no context for that. That's where Israel was. So this new generation begins a cycle that the rest of the book will follow. Israel will fall from the blessing of God through disobedience. And they'll begin worshiping other gods. This is why God said, don't intermarry with the nations around you and push them out of the land. It wasn't because God hated those people. It's not because God didn't have salvation in mind for those non-Jewish people. But at the same time, if they were unrepentant and allowed to stick around, it was going to be a process of osmosis. They were going to take on some of the characteristics of the things around them and start to bend their knee to gods that they should not have been serving, right? And this would lead to them being oppressed by surrounding nations. And this cycle begins, and the first judge is raised up to deliver them. So Israel forgot God, disobeyed God, worshipped other gods, false gods, and now they're being oppressed. So God raises up a judge. His name is Othniel. And Othniel's story is told over only 4 verses in Judges chapter 3. And it can be summarized as this: Israel had done evil in the eyes of God. They were enslaved by a rival king named, and this name's going to stink coming out of my mouth, I'm sorry, but it's Cushan Rishathaim. Big, yeah, two fake, those are made up names, all right? And subject to him, this king, for 8 years. I want you guys to notice this. First time they're being oppressed, it lasted for 8 years. Then Judges 4:10 tells us the Spirit of the Lord came on this judge so that he would become the first judge of Israel and he would lead Israel to war against their slavers. And they would end up winning, and peace rests on the land for 40 years. However, the 40 years of peace ends. And it ends when this judge, Othniel, dies. That's also going to be a pattern. God raises up a leader. That leader serves justice. He walks righteously. But as soon as the watching eye of a man is gone, God doesn't change. God's still looking after them. they get comfortable and start moving the wrong direction again. So Israel begins the cycle once more by sinning and doing evil in the eyes of God until God's anger is built up against them, and they begin to be conquered and enslaved by another king named Eglon of Moab. This enslavement was worse than the first, and not only did Eglon, this Moabite king, rule over them, but his people, the Moabites, abused Israel as well. And this king invited the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him in attacking and conquering more and more and more of Israel. This enslavement lasts 18 years. First one, 8 years. Second disobedience, 18 years. Israel once more cries out as they realize that they need God to deliver them. So God raises up another judge. This judge's name is Ehud. Guys, this is one of the coolest stories of the Bible for me. All right? Just like from an attitude standpoint. All the whole like sweetness and love Christianity, true. Ehud's a good version of the other side of this. Let's read this together, okay? Ehud is raised up and does perhaps the most hardcore thing ever. He takes an 18-inch sword, a cubit, according to the Bible, it's about 18 inches. He straps it to his right thigh, and then he takes tribute, or the taxes owed to this king, and tells him, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." So this king sends everyone out of the area, says, "Close the doors. It's just going to be me and Ehud." Probably thinking that this guy's going to sell out his people, give him some reconnaissance, something like that, right? Then Ehud approaches him, gets real close, and says, "I have a message from God for you," and then stabs him in the belly. And this king was so fat that this 18-inch blade becomes encased in him. Says his entrails blow forward. Not a great detail, but it's true. The sword becomes lodged and encased in the fat, and he can't retrieve it. So he leaves the sword in the king. To me, it sounds like it hit a spine. It hit the spine and stayed there. All right? This king dies as all of his help thinks that he's using the restroom in that inner chamber and dares not go in. Which makes me wonder, what was this dude's trips to the restroom like? That the sounds of him dying and using the restroom are somewhat similar. The Bible records that they waited, quote, an embarrassingly long time to go in. Which during this, Ehud makes his escape. He goes onto the balcony, he takes off, right? He's long gone by the time they check what's going on. Ehud then raises up an army and kills 10,000 Moabite soldiers. And then they become subjects to Israel, completely turning the tables. And this peace lasts for 80 years. During this 80 years, another judge is spoken of taking place during that lifetime. A third judge named Shamgar. What's interesting about Shamgar is his whole story is recorded in one verse. All we know about him is the following. He went out and killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That was a stick you used to guide your animal. That's basically a bow staff. All right? Meaning there was a guy who killed 600 Philistine enemy soldiers with the same weapon as the worst Ninja Turtle. It's the purple one. So we don't know if this was all at once or accumulative, but God sent out a hitman against the Philistine soldiers, and this is what happened, right? We see the cycle restart, and we say that Shamgar took place during the life of Ehud because the Bible in the next chapter records that upon the death of Ehud, Israel once more starts a cycle of evil. So let's establish a few things before we get into the story of the fourth judge, Deborah. Number one, Israel is in constant disobedience to God. And when they aren't, it only lasts as long as their judge lives. They are more fearful of their human leader than respectful of their almighty God. All right? Number two, Israel's punishments are getting more and more severe with each rebellion. All right? The captivity and the years that it lasts are getting worse. Number three, the general people of Israel aren't spoken of as being in touch with God in any meaningful way. This is going to be a very interesting dynamic in the story that we're going to go through, because it seems as though they're substituting a relationship with God for a relationship with a judge who has a relationship with God. Meaning that as soon as that connection piece is gone, they start to immediately veer towards evil. All right, there's something powerful about that for us, guys. If we are more respectful of the people of God than God, of the men and women who we see in our lives who serve God well, than actually connected to God, we are not going to have the legs to continue forward past a season, right? So let's open up, guys, if you want to read along in Judges chapter 4. Can someone read verses 1 through 3 for me?
Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help.
So here's our setting, guys, for our next hero. All right, what's going on? Same cycle. It's getting a little worse. All right, what's the main thing you guys take away from this as far as the threat that they're facing? They faced kings before, they faced Canaanites before. What makes this so much different? Technology. What technology do they have? Chariots fitted with iron, 900 of them. Why is that a significant thing? Israel had chariots. Why does it mention that they were suited with iron, fitted with iron? Bronze Age, yeah. So iron wasn't something that was commonly used. All right, the time between iron and atomic bombs is shorter than when bronze started being used for weapons to iron. Meaning Israel probably didn't have iron swords or spearheads. Meaning these were impenetrable. All right, if you hit this chariot with your sword breaks. If you shoot arrows and they duck behind this chariot, your arrows break. All right? You do not stand a chance against these things. Who knows what World War I looked like when tanks rolled onto the battlefield? They didn't know what to do with them, right? If you send out infantry to go fight a tank right now and they have no artillery, no tanks, nothing, what kind of chance do they have to win? Very low, right? They better be very creative and crazy. This is going to get real personal real fast, right? Especially if it's our tanks against a foreign army, right? Israel is never spoken of at any point as being like the creme de la creme of warriors when they're not empowered by God. All right? This is not America fighting back against just tanks, right? With superior strategies and stuff like that. These people don't have a standing military. There's no lifetime generals. All right? These people raise up when threats come. So you have an inexperienced army facing an experienced army who has the technological advantage. All right? This is not good. There's no way they're getting out of this without divine intervention. And this becomes clear to them, right? 20 years in, they start to cry out for God, going, we need something to change. So we read about this in verses 4 and 5. Who wants to read that for me?
Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided.
Judges says, number 1, as little about her appointments as being the leader or judge of Israel as it said about Shamgar, the bow staff expert. We have one verse. That's it. All right? How did this come to be? Why was this? How long had she been leading? We don't know. All right? We don't know how she was appointed. But it is often stated that her appointments was due to what? Why was she the leader of Israel? Because of her husband? What else? Nobody else would. The common thing I heard was always there was no qualified man who would answer the call. So Deborah. Scripture doesn't say that. All right? I read this and studied it, and I had to reestablish my understanding of this story because of it. I thought that would have been plain as day. I thought that would have been like the first verse. No man stepped up, so Deborah. All right? It's crazy to me that I have had that so long as a part of my theology when it's not correct. It's just not true, you know? I had to re-examine the story, which is awesome to me because it still means we're growing, right? It means that we have more to learn. But let's talk about this a little bit, right? There's implication here, but there is no scripture that says that. There's a theme in the book of Judges, right? About the nation of Israel becoming more and more wicked, hence their oppression lengthening each time as they walk away from God. But also in the Judges, we start to see a degradation. There's a breakdown. The first judge was the nephew of one of the original spies, Caleb, who said God would overcome all challenges and walked righteously, right? But the last one would be Samson, a man with seemingly little to no care for God's will. So some point out that after Shamgar, we see Deborah, and it's a sign that the judges are being affected in a major way, right? They say, look, Shamgar's not even spoken of as being a righteous leader, just a warrior. So when Deborah steps up, well, it's because no man would. It just shows that there's a breakdown that's going on steadily, right? And we can make the case that the narrative gives reason to suggest this. But I definitely don't think we can make the claim that this idea is anything more than conjecture, because it's not biblically factual. All right? We can hold opinions. We have to read Scripture and come to some sort of an understanding of it. Yet at the same time, I should never hold up a Bible story and say, this is proof of what I believe, when the Scripture does not authoritatively back it. So we have to be intellectually and spiritually honest with this, all right? Others also point towards Barak. He's going to be another character in the story and say that he was supposed to be the judge because he helps to lead Israel in this story, but he refused. However, that is never said in this story, and Barak was only ordered by God through Deborah to make war, not to lead as the judge afterwards, right? So after this somewhat controversial parts of these verses, we meet Deborah operating in a gifting from God that is also controversial. Wouldn't you know it? She's mentioned as being a prophet or prophetess, depending on the translation you're reading. This too is controversial because for some churches they carry the idea that a woman speaking the word of God to men or in a mixed crowd is not okay, right? Here she's delivering a message from God to all of Israel. There's not a differentiation here. So it's important that we do not overemphasize or minimize what we're reading and how it plays into our understanding of Scripture. Deborah was the undisputed leader of Israel during this time. She was appointed to this position by God. This was not a man-made position, right? And Israel is never handed over to another leader while she lives. While on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that Deborah was not a high priest or in a place of ministerial leadership, which was forbidden in the Old Testament. There's a differentiation there. She's not breaking down a gender wall that was set there before. And number two, she did not serve in all the same ways as other male judges. Particularly in this story, she was not the military leader who led the army, as we're about to read about. So if we want to talk more about this dynamic, guys, after our study, I'm here for it, okay? I want to talk about how this compares in the New Testament. I don't want there to be murkiness. I want there to be clarity, all right? But at this point in our study, we also have to be honest because guess what? That wasn't the point of this in the Bible, all right? Her being in this story is not the point. God could have easily have started his story here with no man stepped up to prove, hey, this isn't a woman's role. Or he could have concluded it with, so women are co-equal in all ways of leadership with men. But the Bible doesn't. This story is not meant to elevate or to diminish the value of women or of Deborah. But at the same time, it's not here to showcase the glory of, it's not here to showcase them. It's here to showcase the glory of God as he works through the willing, okay? So for us, there's a temptation to look at Deborah as just a point of conflict. Some people are going to say, this is why we're egalitarian, meaning men, women, same, no difference. Some will look at this and go, there's clear differences. This is why women only serve in these different roles. The Bible is murky on this in this 2-chapter story about Deborah because it wasn't the point. We're missing the point if that becomes what we're talking about, right? We don't need to qualify Deborah in our minds, and there's no reason for us to disqualify her from what she did. But at the same time, if she's the point, we miss the point. So as we read forward, let's focus on what God did, okay? All right, verse 6. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Another version, the New King James says, has not the Lord of Israel commanded you? And that's kind of an important thing for what comes next. She's not saying, here's my order, do it. She's saying, God has already placed this on your heart. Let me reaffirm it. I'll explain why that's important later. He says, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to Kishon River and give him into your hands. Guys, this is the glory of what Deborah does here. Deborah serves a very, very important role. She is someone who models dedication through faith. In the midst of a faithless people, she stands up and obeys God and has a connection. She hears from God to call for Barak, and she confirms him what God had already been speaking into his heart. And you know what? Great Christians do this. This is what wonderful Christian leaders do. Let me tell you from a pastor's standpoint, a pastor's job is not to give you a calling. I don't look at Caleb and go, Caleb, you're called to this, and then Caleb's life is dedicated to that, right? A pastor not be going, we don't have kids ministry workers. Michelle, your new calling is because we have need. That's not why we're here. Michelle's like, no, please. I already have 3 of them at home. Me too, sis, me too. We affirm what God is already doing in the life of our congregants, right? We are there to affirm and to grow and to support the calling God has put on your life, even season to season as it changes, and from person to person to support the differences that God has given you, right? Any great leader is one who is in step with God rather than trying to wield the authority God gave them to accomplish their own private will. Deborah succeeds in this. Deborah doesn't go, oh, there's going to be a war? Put me in front. I want the glory. Deborah doesn't go, Barak has to do this, and then she adds a bunch of caveats. And I want you to wear purple, and I want you to skip into battle, and I want you to sing about me, and I want you to... She delivers the message of God that's already going on in his heart. What is she acting as? A mouthpiece. And what does God have her doing in this? What's her role in this? Affirming, giving confidence, backing up, encouraging, right? This is one Christian looking at the other going, Caleb, God's clearly got something going on. Megan, God's doing this, all right? Is he speaking to you this way? You need to move on that, sis, all right? Don't have any fear about it. You do this. God's moving in you. He's speaking to me too. I can't wait to see this happen in your life. That's what Deborah's doing. It's an exciting thing, right? She isn't commanding. She's confirming. She's saying, God has called you to do this, so do it. There's a blessing on the other side. As we mentioned before, there's a process of breaking down taking place in Israel. So even their military leader, Barak here, isn't a particularly faith-filled man of valor. Who wants to read verse 8 for me?
Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go.
I tell my wife the same thing. I'll get the groceries, but you come with me. Don't send me, please. Guys, what are we seeing from the heart of Barak here? Fear, right? Fear conquering faith. What else? Especially if he's had a word already given to him, and then Deborah's like, God's speaking to you, do it. And then he's like, what? No, still, because I need you. What else is going on in this man's heart? Barak does not fight the fact that he's been called to this task. He doesn't say, well, maybe it's not me, though. You should pray again, Deborah. He knows he's called to it, but he fears that without Deborah, he will not have what he needs to succeed. He doesn't have faith that God can speak to or lead him privately. So he thinks that he must have someone who's in touch with God, Deborah, there to intercede for him and act as the line of communication. That's a tragedy, guys. This will mirror a future king of Israel named Saul. All right? Saul's story has a couple of phases. He's appointed. He does right by God. Things go well. They win battles. Do you know when the downward turn starts? When he starts disobeying. When does he start disobeying? The prophet Samuel retires from leadership. Tells Saul, great, it's on you now. I'm not going to give you the marching orders from God. Immediately we see deterioration, right? Saul had no connection with God. So that lack of relationship was a downfall of Saul, as we'll read about later, because Samuel steps away and immediately he disobeys God rather than relying on him. It's not wrong if we don't have the strongest relationship with God, but guess what? If there's been a spiritual father or mother or big brother or sister in our life who has helped to affirm what God's doing in our lives, when they step away, the answer is not give up. The answer is to then grow in that relationship because you know what it looks like. You know what it looks like for someone to have confidence in God. You know what the effect is on others' life. So if there's a gap there, you step up and grow into it. You don't shirk away and go, it can't be me. I'm just too young a Christian. Well, it can't be me. I'm not a very good reader. It can't be me. I'm not a good speaker. Bring what gifts God has given you to the table. Do everything you can to help support others and grow your relationship with God, because you know what? We need powerful prayer warriors who can't speak in front of a crowd of 10. And we need powerful teachers and preachers who can speak in front of thousands. And we need powerful evangelists who speak to one really well and personally. We need people to do all sorts of jobs. But that cannot happen unless we are in step with God. The people we give thanks for have nothing special about them other than that they were given a couple of gifts and talents and they had a good connection with God, right? That is the secret sauce. Barak would start as Saul did. But you know what? After the story concludes, he would grow past his immaturity. Later being remembered in Hebrews 11, a chapter dedicated to highlighting God's power in the lives who were faithful and had faith in him. So as we're about to read about this uncertainty, I would encourage you with this. Maybe don't just beat down on Barak. Maybe take comfort in the fact that sometimes we're more like Barak than Deborah, and God doesn't give up on us. There can be work in our lives anyways, and God can redeem the situation. We can grow into honoring God better and better, even if that's not where our story starts. Okay? Let's read Judges chapter 4, verses 9 and 10.
"Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him.
Beautiful. Guys, Deborah does not just throw her hands up in the face of Barak's fear, all right? She understands the work of God needs to happen, so she agrees, but prophetically tells Barak that there will be consequences for his fear overwhelming his faith in that moment, right? Another will receive the honor for slaying the enemy general Sisera, and it's going to be a woman. Now, if we read that, who do we think of? I think it's going to be Deborah, right? He's taking Deborah. Deborah's going to take the glory, right? Barak still accepts this. Why? Why do you guys think Barak accepted this term? It was easier? Yeah, it was definitely easier, right? What else? He could have been like, you know what? Second thought, I'll do it. All right. Right? And some people are like, oh, it's because he was so noble. No, this was not nobility. All right? This was not him like, no, I don't want the glory. Give it to anyone else. Yes, of course, a woman. What's he showcasing here? He's still scared, right? He's still very scared. He accepts this because he doesn't see victory as assured. He knows God has called him. Deborah says, the enemy general is going to fall, but if you take me, a woman's going to get the glory. What is she telling him? There's going to be victory. He still doesn't believe that God can necessarily do it without her, right? He looks at this and goes, I'd rather survive this 900 chariot, armored army and make it out than have the glory, right? He's going, I'm just going to give myself the best chances of survival, even if that means that I forfeit any chance of fulfilling maybe what I was supposed to do, right? And again, this is a wonderful picture for our lives, guys. I don't want to be so scared of the journey God is leading me down that I willingly forfeit blessings just to make sure I feel safer. Was Barak in any real danger, even if he was outgunned, if God had called him to fight against Sisera? No. Was there any real chance of failure if God's will was to overthrow this enemy army? No, right? He was not in more danger. Yet he still gives away a blessing God had for him in order to feel safer. Guys, do we do that? Let me ask you, what does that look like practically today in our lives? And I'm not saying your testimony, but how do you see this take place in our society? I'll go first. Seen a lot more missionaries to, tropical areas than dangerous ones. yeah, I'll go on the missions field. Anywhere you want to send me. Hawaii, Bahamas, they need Jesus. Dominican Republic, yeah, they need Jesus. Can I drop a bit of a controversy bomb on you guys? What about politically? How many times do we vote for people that we feel will increase our safety versus how many times do we vote according to our Bibles? I was in a discussion online this week with somebody over the topic of abortion. And someone said, I'm going to vote for the lesser of two evils. And I was like, but are either of them biblical? And they pointed out, it's a little late this year for us to really find that candidate to have a real chance of winning and things like that, right? But you know what? We didn't necessarily start that way. We got to it, right? When we were voting, if my consciousness is more on economy, which is important, or national security or other things, which again are all worthy of our time and attention. But if I'm willing to put all the altar of those things, or if I'm willing to attach my identity to those leaders rather than saying, I might even vote for that person, but this is what I'm looking for and this is what I'm hoping for our nation. If we're going to go get in fights over a political leader and sacrifice our Christianity on the altar of that, you know what? Usually we're going because this is a safer option for me, or this keeps me safer, or this is more in line with my desires, rather than us sitting back going, you know what? You can fire all that rhetoric at me. I'm not going to fire back because I don't want to compromise my Christian walk in your eyes for the sake of trying to win a political battle, right? And I will say this conversation online was with other Christians. All right, I'm not fighting with the unsaved about, like, how dare you, and I'm not saying that there's a perfect candidate or anything like that. But for us, there's very real world applications for how we look at things. For us, if the biblical is not the ultimate, if the biblical is not the goalpost that we are shooting for, we're going to end up in some wild places, right? So we go back to Barak. Sacrificing blessings for added unnecessary perceived safety, right? Now, who is going to get that honor? Judges drops a hint in verse 11. Verse 11 says, Now Heber, the Kenites, had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zananim and near Kadesh. All this verse tells us, guys, is that there's some dude named Heber, the Kenite. He lived in a particular place that was uncommon for his people. These people were nomadic, so they could be around, right? But if you know anything about this story, you'll know what this is going to mean in just a bit. And for those who don't, I'm going to say it like this. God has put someone in just the right place to entrap the enemy. All right? We're going to see God work that together in just a second. Beautiful. Sisera is made aware that Barak and his men are maneuvering themselves for an attack, right? He understands, oh shoot, there's an army forming. We need to get moving. So he calls in all the big guns, right, that he has to swing the tide of battle in his favor. And despite their early running here and positioning, Israel's still at a major disadvantage. If this is just going to play out, God's not involved, Israel's about to get crushed. They're about to lose 10,000 men. They're about to get their butts kicked. And then there's going to be some severe penalties for this uprising, right? Verse 14 says this, Then Deborah said to Barak, Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you, again supporting an acknowledgement that he already should have, right? So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Again, once more, guys, nothing happens till a word is spoken in faith. Deborah did not draw a sword. She did not give a rousing speech. She did not say, in the name of Deborah and Israel, show these heathens who we are. She reaffirms already known truth and the commandments of God. She leads by example in faith and tells Barak to trust God himself. Go. This is the moment, right? What comes of this? Let's read verses 15 and 16. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. We're going to talk about why he did that in a second. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Guys, 900 chariots. That's probably at least 2 people, all right? And that's just the chariots, not the army. This was not a small gathering of people, okay? God leads Israel through Deborah's words and Barak's charge. God routs the enemy army, capturing or destroying many of the chariots that stood as the surety of their enemy's success, right? Where was their faith, guys? Their faith was in their overwhelming technology and its advantages, right? What does God do? He destroys them. He goes, oh, that's where your faith is? That's why you thought you could overcome my people? Great, fabulous. They're not going to make it out. They're not going to get back to you. We're going to break your strength in front of everyone's eyes, right? In fact, in the next chapter of Judges, Deborah sings a song recalling the fact that God didn't just bless the battle through empowering the warriors of Israel, but it says God sent rain to muddy the battlefields. Let me ask you guys, how do you think heavy iron chariots would do in a little marshy fields? If any of us have had the snow and rainfall out in our farm fields, if there's any ranches, how are those cows doing out there? How are those trucks doing out there right now? All right? If there's like a torrential downpour, how do you think wood and iron chariots are going to do? Not great. Not great, right? Going to become a bit of a liability. In fact, it says that these iron chariots were completely bogged down and useless. And in verse 21 of chapter 5, it says that God also flooded the boundaries of the Kishon River and swept many of the chariots and horses away. Not only were these chariots bogged down, but then God's like, and you don't need them either. Just takes them out, right? So Barak and Israel pursue the army, and they stop at a certain point because it's past the edge of the promised land. In other words, they expel the Canaanites from the promised land like they were supposed to all along. And it says all Sisera's troops perished to the last man. So not only did God let Israel win, but he showed them that it was going to be by his power. It wasn't just, we had the best soldiers and the best cunning tactics and the best general, right? God also set the battlefield to their advantage. He also took an active hand in this, right? But wait, if every one of the troops were cut down, how was the glory going to go to a woman for killing Sisera? There's no women running with the army. Sisera wasn't with his men. Which means that when the battle got going, he knew it was a lost cause at some point. He hops out of the chariot. He goes, everyone's leaving this way back towards home, which means that's where the Israelites are going. So he goes a different direction. Homie absolutely has his confidence shattered and takes a detour. All right, this man who came in confident is going, we now stand no chance. All right, I want no part of this. I just want to get out alive. Again, tables have turned. Verse 17 says this, Sisera meanwhile fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, the Kenites, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber, the Kenites. Two things to note about this. Number one, he fled to the quarters of Jael. Back then, these tents would have different parts for spouses, meaning Sisera decided to run not only to a friendly tent, but he ran and hid in the women's tent. All right? How many of you guys have played hide and seek in a church as a kid? They never check the opposite gender restroom. You're playing for keeps, that's where you go, all right? This man thinks there's no way they're going to do it, and he's kind of breaking some rules of engagement by doing this, you know? He's putting the women of this encampment at risk. He might take one of them as a human shield, right? No character, no honor whatsoever. Number two, we're going to see that God seems to be happy to use the most unlikely of people to work together his own ends, okay? A woman leader of Israel? What? Deborah, that's so different. A cowardly war general in Barak? What? That's so different. Now he's going to use another party, a woman named Jael. Verses 18 through 21 say this. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid. So he entered her tent. She covered him with a blanket. I'm thirsty, he said. Please give me some water. She opened up a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. We all know if you want someone to go to sleep, warm milk, right? Nice blankie. Don't worry, you're safe. Verse 20, stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone in there, say no. Verse 21, but Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and hammered and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. All right, yeah, let's talk about it real quick. Some of us don't realize it was the woman's job to put up the tent. This was not a novice, all right? She knew what she was doing, all right? She was about a mission. And I love it because the visual here is he is now pinned to the ground. It's not boom and he's incapacitated. Went through to the other side, into the ground. Homie's not leaving, all right? He's not getting up. He's not walking that one off. It's very graphic. And I love it too. I saw some posts online that say that. They're like, you don't deserve me at my Proverbs 31 woman unless you can handle me at my JL. 100% true, all right? Both operating for God, all right? All right, this woman, Jael, guys, was so unthreatening to Sisera that he completely drops his guard around her. He looks at her and sees a woman of little strength compared to his. Having married a man who was a part of a family who had allied themselves with the enemy rather than their distantly connected kin, but it seems her heart is far more submitted to the cause of Israel and obedient to God. So she goes, look, you're already breaking the rules of engagement. Shouldn't be at a woman's tent. All right, I'm going to break the rules of rolling out the red carpet. I'm going to invite you and say, there's not a problem in the world, and then there's going to be a problem. If anyone was alive in this time, guys, she would have been the least likely hero possible. Kenites, guys, are not Israelites. Kenites are also nomadic shepherds known for being peaceful, in no way warriors. And yet, as predicted by Deborah, a woman would be the vessel of God's wrath upon Sisera for the cruelty of his defiance. And then we get so much sass in verse 22. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man you're looking for. How cryptic, Jael. So he went in with her. I love the way it appears. And there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple. Dead. As if there was doubt. Yeah, exactly. Again, Ehud, the guy with the sword, would have been so proud of Jael's delivery, all right? Ehud's move, I have a message from God for you. Stab. Jael's method, yes, Sisera, I think he might be around here. Let me go show you in the back room. Dead. All right? 2 verses 23 and 24 to close here. It says, on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, meaning that he gave them a big, victory over him. Verse 24, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed him. Guys, this battle not only destroyed any dominion that Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, had over the Israelites, but they destroyed the threats that the generation after Joshua had neglected to when they originally took the lands. This was not only restoration, but God-led revival and new groundbreaking obedience through Deborah's time as the leader of Israel. The next chapter of Judges, again, is a song sung by Deborah and Barak, who sang of God's work through the efforts of Israel and Jael specifically. And then it gets... If anyone tells you Christians can't talk trash, read the next chapter. At the end, it talks about Sisera's mother being like, oh, where is he? And they're like, he's not taking plunder. He's not going to show up in a little bit. He's dead. All right? They specifically praise what Jael did, and then it's pretty bad. And it ends in the remark that the land of Israel had peace for 40 more years. Guys, what amazes me most is that following Deborah, every judge we have would have more than a shred of information about a major note of pride, compromise, or even murder in their lives. Deborah isn't spoken of as having these major issues. She is not, and I'm going to stress this, not a picture of an empowered, independent woman. She's a picture of a humble and obedient woman in the service of a powerful God. And the results could not be more clear. She exemplifies what any great leader should be, and perhaps because she wasn't coming from a place of normal societal authority, humility was easier to embrace. And through that humble obedience to God, God does amazing things in Israel through her leadership and in this time. Okay? So for us as Christians, we need to exit the lens of societal pressure, of feminism, masculinity being machismo, and all this different stuff. We need to enter into understanding that God uses who he sees fit, which is the obedient and humble, that our pictures of our heroes in the Bible are not flying flags of causes other than Christ. Okay? And we need to be able to go there's something in my heart that I'm struggling with within gender identity, within biblical law, anything like that, I need to do what they would have done. Take it to God, be submissive to the word, and pray about what God has me to do and what God has me to be. Because this is a beautiful picture, and if we frame it as simply gender roles, we reduce the beauty of it. Okay?
Thank you for listening to today's message. If you would like to listen to more messages like this, you can find us on Spotify and iTunes by searching for Thousand Hills Podcast. Thank you for listening to and supporting this ministry of Thousand Hills Church.